Then we have another Australian speaker. It's Brian Iselin. And here you are. Brian, thank you also for being with us from Sweden. And you are the founder of Slave Free Trade. You have the floor.
Great. Yes. Thanks, Michel, and Eve, and to the incredibly distinguished colleagues on the panel. For anyone who's tuned in the last few weeks, you'll have noted one or two things about my approach. And I think Michel likes this. I'm actually usually pretty clear about what I mean. And that I also come to this subject through a strongly mission-oriented career of more than 30 years. Over those years, one thing I've learned is to quickly work out what is and stay focused on the actual problem, not perceived problems. So if I can paint a very simple picture for you. When you're confronted by a man with a knife and a bad attitude, the problem is less the knife in the hand and more the guy behind it. The knife actually becomes a distraction, not the problem. Why? Because I can neutralize the knife, but the guy behind it will still be there, and so will his bad attitude. Success in this case means I have to both disarm the guy and make him want to change his attitude. So given my analogy, let me make this relevant for you. Let's talk about what really is the problem confronting us, all of us here for a second. It's not poverty, it's not sexual abuse or unemployment, it's not migration, documented or otherwise, it's not being in prostitution, and it's not inadequate laws. The problem confronting us is someone who makes the moral and economic choice to exploit someone else. It's all important for us to understand the why behind this attitude. If for no other reason than if we're not addressing the why, we've just taken the knife away from someone who still means to kill us. For exploiting others in the workplaces, business owners' why is that every single day they calculate it doesn't hurt their business to do so, and might even be some profit-making advantage in doing so. They reason, although not always in elaborate terms, that there's no business advantage for them to treat people better. And just remember, for a huge percentage of the world's population, that dreadful Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman convinced them that intrinsic good has nothing at all to do with business. He told them, and university MBA programs and plutocrats around the world also tell them to make money at any cost. And so millions of business people do that every single day. There is our problem. There is the guy behind the knife. So the problem for anyone addressing exploitation, whether you define it as human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, slavery, and servitude, is business people who don't find a place for intrinsic good in their business. And they abuse human rights because it doesn't hurt their business to do so. They allow a culture of exploitation to enter the workplace and set up camp. Investigating the killing of some children in prawn supply chains, I found the prawns made their way to supermarket freezers in Europe. Everyone in the entire chain was blind from first port of sale to the consumer to the conditions under which they were caught. The consumer, the retailer, the suppliers all along the way were oblivious to the facts behind the product. And that is a fact of modern supply chains. So this is how I came to create Slave Free Trade, for which Michel has invited me kindly to talk about today. After years of figuratively disarming guys, only to find them coming at us again and again, I thought this has got to end now. Let's address the actual problem, the guy behind the knife. Let's see if we can find a way to give that guy reasons not to come at us anymore. And, thinking rather hopefully utopian, see if we can give that guy reasons to maybe say, I'm with you, that there is a better way, this is a better way to do business. So the slavers and exploiters over the years that I've met are not all, and excuse my French, complete bastards. Many are just opportunistic users of people, like so many of the world's population. They're not very hardcore, actually. We can take a lot of them out of the business of slaving and exploiting by giving them something more positive to strive for. And that's how we can actually systemically reduce the prevalence of modern slavery. It can't all be about intrinsic good. It still needs to boil down to money. We can give them a better place to be, but in fact it needs to be a better market to be for them to be interested. And that means arriving at a completely new way of thinking about modern slavery, reconceptualizing human rights and work. It means building a new economic model that advantages your business if you respect human rights. An economic model that makes your human rights performance part and parcel of your bottom line, not the opposite of your bottom line. And effectively, that takes turning market forces back on themselves to incentivize and reinforce good behavior. This is not going to be any small feat. Thanks to COVID, we've all come to realize that we touch our face every day, and we touch slavery every day more often than we touch our faces. Your morning cup of tea or coffee, that chocolate cookie that you know just doesn't equal love, the canned tomatoes in your insanely good pasta sauce, the laptop you're watching this webinar on, the rubber in your phone case, the gold in your watch, those to die for diamond earrings, and the shampoo you used this morning. It's not a small problem. And you've heard over the past few webinars all the numbers from which you can draw only one inescapable conclusion, that hundreds of millions of women, men and children are being exploited and abused every single day in workplaces around the world. So against this backdrop, I very quickly have come to realize, after 20 years working on slavery, that to come up with a solution, we have to be able to scale massively, which means we need to be able to automate also massively. Every law enforcement response has hit the wall at this very point. Every audit regime has hit the wall at this exact point. Scale. If you can't scale, you can never come even within radar distance of solving a problem like modern slavery. So what I suggest is we stop focusing on the negative. We stop relying on meddling at the murky end of the human rights spectrum, because the only way to detect what is happening at that end of the pool is with people like me going out and investigating. And that can't be automated. We can't be scaled. Human rights in workplaces globally exist on a spectrum. So I started to wonder what would happen if we lifted our gaze to the other end of the spectrum, because we've been so myopically focused on modern slavery. What if we looked at prevention instead of treatment? What might a global vaccination program look like instead of just treating every casualty as they come in? Human rights in workplaces do exist on a spectrum. At one end is that murky pool called modern slavery, and in this conceptualization, you can forget, for now, all the legal definitions behind it, because that murky, fetid pool at the bottom end is just characterized by low respect for human rights. Either one or two rights extremely eroded, or lots could be. In any case, we just know that life is pretty shitty down there. At the far end of the spectrum is a far better place, with fountains of warm flowing, slave-free chocolate. Let's call that place decent work. If we can tell that someone is at the decent work end, not the modern slavery end, you know what we've just done? We've proved that there is a culture of respect for human rights in that workplace. In so doing, we have also disproved that modern slavery exists, because decent work and modern slavery, let me tell you from 2 decades of experience, they can't coexist. They are like kryptonite to each other. But more than that, it's crucial to remember that all human rights issues, gender pay gap, forced labor, racial discrimination, these rise out of culture. Human rights abuses at work are never isolated incidents. If you identify the culture, you identify the issue. If you map the culture, then you know the path. The further towards decent work a workplace culture is mapped, the less likely human rights issues are present. And the higher you are on the scale, the more intolerant of and resistant to human rights abuses your workplace is. And why is this important? Because that tells us that a culture of human rights can actually inoculate a workplace from human rights abuses. So to make this examination of workplaces possible in creating slave-free trade, we first needed a standard to define the decent work modern slavery spectrum. It might not surprise you to learn that when I started slave-free trade just over 4 years ago, a definition or framework that could be operationalized, that I could take to the field, did not exist. We had to make it. And we decided it also needed to be universal. So we come back to the professor's comments on universality. I hope you'll agree with me when I say that it is completely unsatisfactory for any model that says a plantation worker in one country should work in a workplace with a lower human rights standard than a high street retail worker in England. And just because a country says a child aged 12 can labor in a plantation doesn't make it right. We have this huge body of international human rights law, some of which has been mentioned here. Our rights are universally agreed. You heard it a few times last week and the week before also. We don't need any new law. But despite the presence of agreed international law on the matter, it's a sad feature of the global business world that international human rights law is an irrelevance. One of the reasons for that irrelevance is that it is so esoteric, it is not operational. If you think that most organizations, most companies, understand the international human rights obligations that apply to their workplaces, you are seriously deluded. If you think they have the will or the means to operationalize human rights treaties, you are again completely mistaken. So, we decided that only a universal and very operational definition and framework was defensible. It had to be easy. It had to be easy because people are lazy. Business people are lazy. Humans have evolved to be lazy for our own good. So we started by picking all the points of existing universally agreed international human rights law that relates to the workplace, rights and conditions, and we grouped them into a set of 10 principles for decent work. No forced labor, no child labor, equal pay, fair hours, no discrimination. You all know the principles. And they work for us in a cascading fashion. That is, underneath each is a handful of human rights conditions, and if you comply well with all of these principles, you have an objectively really good place to work. So operationalizing that, 10 principles, 25 human rights issues are canvassed under that. But we need to get it out to those who can tell us what's really going on. That means our model needed not just to be operationalized, but democratized. So under each condition is a handful of indicators, the sorts of things I would look for going out on an investigation. Compiling these indicators, we arrived at a global set of 100 indicators for a human rights, slave-free workplace. You'll ask me why 100, and all I can say is that because 1 is too few to get an understanding, and 1,000 is too many to operationalize. So we arrived at 100. And we needed to go well beyond existing standards. Every existing standard for social sustainability, and let me be very blunt about this, the so-called S in the ESG, is based on the corporate view. If you want to look at almost any existing model of certification, B Corp, Global Reporting Initiative, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, all the sustainability ratings agencies, their evidence is pretty much entirely the corporate view. Unfortunately, if you dig down on any listing, rating, assessment, what a company says about itself becomes the foundation for every social sustainability report on that company. It's unsatisfactorily circular. In the same way that supplier codes of conduct are not worth the paper they are written on, a company's own assessment, or an assessment by another company that they just paid for, is worth very, very, very little. You can call me untrusting, but I don't want to be living in that house of cards. So we have to go well beyond the corporate view. So enter slave-free trade. What we're building, what we've got, is a membership system. You join us, we are a non-profit organization, an NGO, that puts members, which is any type of organization, through continuous, all the time, real-time assessment and monitoring against the framework of international human rights law. If you have workplaces and people, you should be human rights compliant. You shouldn't be in business if you're not. And if you demand it of others, then let's start by looking in the mirror. So the 4 core processes in our model are values alignment, workforce assessment, network mapping, and impact communications. Now, how am I going for time, Michelle? Please just send me a message if I'm... Okay, I'll keep going. Values alignment is attaining the corporate view. It's a kind of desk audit, let's say, gauging the policy and legal compliance to make sure the organization at least talks the talk. The importance with this one is that we know that if the organization has what is needed in their policy toolkit, then they're at least ready to address the issues that we will later find. Workforce assessment. This is obtaining the individual view in workplaces. This process involves systematically asking, this is going to sound fairly big because it is, asking every single person in a workplace about their conditions in real time, all the time. We feed cross-cutting experiential and observational questions. So that's not just what happened to me, but what's happening around me. To everybody in real time, we get a 360-degree view of the workplace. The answers are mapped back to our human rights framework so that nobody we are asking needs to know anything technical. They don't need to know what the law is because our framework translates it back up. Network mapping is the third process. This is how we understand who does business with whom. because no organization is an island. Investors have investees, retailers have suppliers, chambers of commerce have members, churches have suppliers. And through this, we promote human rights performance within networks, taking advantage of, let's say, network effects. We link their performance. So this is a behavioral process like the entire system of slave-free trade. We are changing businesses who previously just bought and sold from each other into collaborators whose network's business performance becomes reliant on their respective human rights performance. The fourth process is impact communications, which is to understand and capture and eventually help communicate the members' why. This is finding out why this member joined, and over time mapping the impact of their process on their workforce, on their business network, and eventually on their customers. Importantly, it also captures finding out how the human rights performance has impacted their bottom line and the extent to which those two things have become interdependent. Because that's what we want. We want a bottom line that is not separate from human rights. Human rights is embedded. So bringing these four processes together, along with measures to fix and eliminate bad practices, we're building a system that we can automate and scale. So if you think back to that human rights spectrum, what we now have is a three-dimensional human rights spectrum. We combine the framework with the four processes and breathe life into international human rights law. Instead of just the two ends of that spectrum, we have a rather more 3D scene. So think of it as two floors joined by escalators. On the ground floor is modern slavery. On the next floor is, on the first floor is the flowing fountains of warm chocolate. And there's an escalator for all of the 10 principles. In fact, there's an escalator for all 100 escalators, all 100 principles, questions, but I couldn't draw 100 escalators. So we can actually tell you which step you are on for every single principle. In fact, every single question that we ask in the framework. And we can tell you over time whether you're moving up or down. And if you're moving down, we can help you turn yourself around and start moving back up again. So in this model, the peculiarities and particularities of the legal definition of human trafficking, it doesn't bother us anymore. It's overall about how you are performing on each human right based on the experience of the people in your workplaces. Importantly, it doesn't just stop with the assessment. We understand what the workplace looks like, that's fine, but remember, we need to address the cause of the problem. Knowing the conditions on the workplace doesn't address the problem. The drivers of the exploiter, if you remember Milton Friedman, is the business person who's made those decisions. So we must distribute our knowledge in a way that benefits them. We've cultivated the best evidence from workplaces, and then we have to deliver that as decision intelligence to people whose consuming decisions can be influenced, because there has to be a return on investment from human rights. And the idea is super simple. We provoke micro behaviors at the demand end that multiplied millions of times give us social change. Michelle, would you like me to finish there? I could keep going on, of course, but I've got the detail of the processes if you want to go through that. But no. You're muted, Michelle. There you go.
Okay. No, Brian, excellent. And definitely you could also answer questions. But I like your straightforward approach, your approach to the root causes, and also with your field experience. I must say it's very much appreciated, and definitely thank you also for the support you did bring to organize those webinars.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to highlight one point when Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez Orlando, he spoke about the Nordic model, and I think there's something that I think it's very important that our listener get it clear. So the Nordic model has several has several points. So the first is that the sex buyer has to be criminalized. So the punishment goes to the person who creates the demand. And then it's very important, and I think later, I think Morgan, you mentioned it, so there has to be a decriminalization of the victims, of the women who are forced in prostitution. Because if they are not criminalized, they can't speak open, they are fear, they are in problems. So this is very important. And I want to have this point very clear, that the so-called Nordic model or equality model is about not punishing the women forced to prostitution. And there's another very important point, that they have to have help to leave prostitution. So, and as I'm a German citizen and I was working in this field for 30 years, and I know that women told me we are not helped. Germany doesn't follow the Nordic model, so there are no real helps to exit prostitution, because they say, oh, it's a job, it's your job, so why to exit? And if we want to have women that are free, and I learned, no, freedom is one of the main points of being human, then they have to have the possibility to exit, and they need help for exit. And of course, awareness raising. So these are points I think are very important to make them clear and highlight them. But maybe as I spoke about it, some of you want to answer or see some points you also want to be highlighted and speak about to our listeners.
What I just wanted to say is that one of the reasons it's not by coincidence that the Nordic model started in Sweden, and there is a lot to be said for.
Sorry, Brian, speak slowly. Speak slowly, please. Speak more slowly. Thank you.
That's not so easy for me, but yes, okay, I'll give it a shot. It's not by accident that the Nordic model started in Sweden, because I think there is, and let's maybe call it a patriarchy index. There needs to be a certain ripeness or fertility in a society to be accepting of such a model, because it requires a conceptualization of prostitution as being something that's created by men for men. And unless your society is ready to say that's problematic, then your society is not ready to implement well the Nordic model. And this is why I think, for example, in the United Kingdom, there is massive opposition to it. And I think in Australia, there would be in some places massive opposition to it, because these societies have not sufficiently moved up in, let's say, the patriarchy index. And by patriarchy index, I'm not just saying men, right? There are also many women who buy into that and will defend that vociferously. I don't know how many times I've been told at a human trafficking conference that, no vagina, no say, trying to kick men from the conversation, which is, I mean, it's obviously completely inappropriate, but the point is that there's a lot vested in this industry, and the ripeness in Sweden, when you say in Sweden to men, you shouldn't, it's wrong to be buying sex, the majority of Swedish men are like, yeah, that's true. Okay. They really do take it in. If you say that in the UK, you'll get punched in the face by so many men. So there's this point of ripeness that we need to consider in the Nordic model. I've seen the Nordic model applied in France, for example, and without any education, without any enforcement, without any policy work, besides the law on the books, nothing happens. The sides of the street are still littered with migrant women being prostituted, and nothing happens to the men who buy them. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.